We have approximately half an hour, 25 minutes for questions, and we can take questions either from the audience in the room or also if you'd like to send a message by chat or unmute yourself and ask a question, raise your hand and ask a question on the Zoom. That's fine as well. So first of all, for those in the room, what questions do you have? Yes, sir.
I want to ask a question about the conflict management efforts. And like right from the beginning of this conflict, we've seen efforts to bring the sides of the table. Obviously, they had negotiations in Belarus, and Turkey now announced that they're going to have called mediation meeting between Russian and Ukrainian prime ministers. Like, should we see these warring sides entering these negotiations with what we call as devious objectives, that they don't really want to negotiate, but they just want to signal that they are like for a peaceful resolution? Or is this a kind of a new pattern where we see conflict management efforts? And by the way, the war is going on. So, like, how can you continue fighting with the other party while you also negotiate with them? Or is this already prevalent in the literature? I guess it'll be more directed towards that.
Are you asking, is there a ceasefire necessary for negotiations to really be genuine? Is that what you mean?
I mean, yeah.
Does it require
Kind of, yeah.
ceasefire?
I mean, we have a ceasefire now declared by Russia, but there had been negotiations already while.
But that was just for the exodus
Yeah,
of
it's a partial
civilians.
ceasefire.
Yeah, it's not a general ceasefire.
Yeah.
No, it's just, yeah,
Sounds interesting. Is it requirement of meaningful negotiations?
Yeah, so I think the question, and I don't know if this is loud enough for the folks on too, but so the question is about whether the negotiations that have been happening thus far, there's a concept in literature of mediation and negotiation with devious objectives, with this idea being that you sit down and negotiate not because you want a peace, but you're sitting down and negotiate to buy time to rebuild your military, or to get some breathing space, or just for the PR benefit, public relations benefit of it, but not a sincere diplomatic effort. And the second part was whether the reason for the whether you can negotiate while you're engaged in conflict. And I think for the second part, I would say yes. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think folks who study conflict management, a lot of us talk about in a very sort of Clausewitzian way that war and negotiation are essentially the opposite sides of the same coin. That it's an effort to resolve a dispute by imposing costs upon your adversary. You can do that through violence, but you can also do that through diplomacy, trying to sort of hem them into a box or to sort of manipulate a situation in order to get what you want. I think your read about the diplomacy now, particularly on the Russian side, I would argue that it is consistent with negotiation with devious objectives. It's hard for me to see the Russian effort at dialogue as being much more than a PR effort, particularly given the Russian predilection to targeting humanitarian corridors. In fact, if I were to bet, and I'm not an expert in terms of the Russian military, but those that I've been reading have suggested that in about 3 to 4 weeks, the Russian military is going to find itself in a very difficult position in terms of material. And that would be precisely the point where I would expect for the Russians to be very interested in negotiating a ceasefire, but not because of a settlement, but to sort of buy time. Right?
And accelerate that could be if the military begins to abandon Putin and the intel service begin to abandon them, because it seems to me that with the leaks that have been coming out about intel matters where Ukraine and the West has gotten that information, I think it's showing a crack within the internal mechanism that the once believers may not be believing at the moment. And that crack can make a difference in their readiness to negotiate. I think
We're not at that point.
we're not there,
We're not
but it
there
might
yet.
be the beginning of the crack. Maybe not.
Because
Just watching.
one thing we tend to assume, by the way, in the West, that somehow Putin, the oligarchs, can hold Putin accountable. It's actually quite the other way around. It's more like a kleptocracy mafia, that the oligarchs depend on Putin more than he depends on them. Now, there might be cracks, and there's some indications, for example, I wrote a piece about the communists who've been supportive of Putin, except for till now. Now they're openly challenging the war. Now, that's not the insider elite, but this was a loyal opposition that is just becoming less loyal. Now, that is.
And what prompted that? That he miscalculated?
Well, no, because they said they voted voted for the annexation of the Donbass. They didn't vote for this invasion.
He went too far.
He went too far, and I think, what Dr. Hudson mentioned earlier about, that's cool. It's interesting because I'm not very optimistic, because right now, they're just restating what their objectives were. That's like neutralization of Ukraine, that they would have to disarm, that they would have to cede all the territories they've lost. And so this is the opening. I know it's an opening salvo, but let's call it close to Putin. And so he would be reiterating what the demands would be, and that also jived with what I heard about Putin's conversation with Naftali Bennett yesterday. That he reiterated these. The one thing that was missing was the regime change. That I guess he's willing to accept Zelensky, but it means they have to neutralize, declare never to join NATO. They also have to disarm, meaning their military has to be limited. They have to seize Crimea, and they have to recognize the independence of the Donbass. So those are all the things he demanded earlier. So it's like he's demanding Ukraine surrender.
They have to personally recognize,
They
and
have to personally-
not that just other countries are recognizing.
That's right. But
And
it's
you
like
don't
surrender.
hold out much hope for Ukraine saying yes.
No, not
Not now.
unless, of course, they're at the verge of defeat, which I don't think is going to happen. But I think right now, I think this is like, I think Dr. Greg's right. This is not serious. This is just, we want to look better. And also, there's humanitarian corridors out of the country. There are 5 of them. 4 of them are to Russia or Belarus. And that's not serious. And that's deliberate. That's not
No,
serious.
thanks. I have a question about negotiations, the reality of negotiation, because we know the reality. Which countries are privately and secretly negotiating to resolve this right now that's not out there in the newswire? We know it's happening, so who is it? How's it going?
Yes, I think. Well, clearly Israel's involved. I mean, Israel's. Turkey has an offer. That's true. I think Belarus, of course, but
Well, Belarus, yeah, different, but maybe Kazakhstan, maybe India.
maybe Kazakhstan, they might be doing it.
Because
India
India
maybe,
staying.
Yeah, anyone that's voted neutral, that might be
Yeah.
partially strategic. It
Yeah.
might not be. They haven't
Well,
picked a
he
side.
said something about China's foreign ministry offering again to
Yeah,
mediate.
okay.
Right. Okay, let me ask a question from the chat here. It says, even after this is from Herbert McCullough, even after the Russo-Ukrainian war, what are the long-term diplomatic and geopolitical consequences for Russia, given its growing diplomatic isolation, especially given how much the sanctions are damaging the Russian economy? And I would say the first thing is that Russia's been trying to diversify its economy away from natural resources. That means movement of goods, that means movement of people, and that means movement of information. All 3 of those have been cut off. So this long-term strategic objective of Russia to have a more robust economy has been completely undermined by this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking a larger number of companies, Western companies, including US companies, are ceasing their operations right now. They're taking their people home and they are stopping the sale of their goods and services. Will that continue? Will it grow? We don't know, but I think that what was becoming in early 2000, what was becoming a really good market for Western companies really is now being sabotaged by the host country. Would I go there right now? No, I would not go there right now.
The question also, I think, has to deal with how can Russia hold out? And to some extent, economic pain causes people to change their behavior. But, the way the Russians are behaving is that they're rallying as if this were the 3rd great fatherland war. This was a war against the West, just like we defeated the Nazis and suffered so much, and we faced so many difficulties, but our sacrifice led to victory. This is among far right circles in Russia, the ones wearing the Z's and marching around. That's sort of, I think, the kind of message the regime is trying to put forward, that we will sacrifice the 3rd great fatherland war against the West. So that also means that they may be able to suffer economic deprivation.
And this is the message that's being put out there on Russian media over and over again, kind of mocking the net effects. Say, oh, you have to go without credit cards. Oh,
Yeah, right.
you have to
Or
go without
McDonald's.
But
Maybelline
they're
or
gonna use
McDonald's.
the Chinese
You
credit
know,
system.
we're stuck. We can do it. Yeah. So they're basically mocking and saying, to their people, you need to be able to suffer some degree because to show how you're committed.
And I think that's the reason why the other geopolitical shift, I think we're already seeing. So we're seeing, what Germany did just a few days ago, I think is a really good example of that. So, significantly increasing defense spending. I think you're going to see sort of kind of a reinvigoration of NATO in a way that I think people have been questioning in the past, largely because of exactly sort of if you are increasingly worried about an increasingly aggressive ultranationalist Russia, there's only one path forward. I think Paul understands that more than anyone else.
Yeah,
question here.
One of the motivations here, as we've talked about already today, was make Russia great again, and make Russia a well-respected, feared great power. Some of the military is not performed up to make Russia great again. I mean, it turns out, John, you mentioned this at the last panel last week, it seems that there's been a lot of corruption, where a lot of the money is supposed to go into maintaining the engines and the tires on the trucks and things. Maybe in someone else's pocketbook, and that's why the trucks are breaking down. So if there's reporters in Russia talking about trucks and tanks breaking down before they get to the Ukrainian border. And it's pretty clear a sign that, it's not quite as strong a military as Putin was led to believe or was believed for whatever reason. So I think that's hurting that cause of making Russia great again, making it a widely respected, but feared great power. So unless things change for them on a battlefield, this actually backfire in that respect.
Kind of in a hypothetical sense, for Russia's domestic view right now, if Russia does finally take Kyiv and take over Ukraine, what is this going to look like for like a lot of these people that have been protesting as far as like against Russia and stuff like that? What is it going to look like for them? And what is it going to look like for the future of Russia as far as relationships with the West at that point? Because obviously we know Putin is going to claim this as a victory no matter what, if he can. No matter if it's negotiations, if it's war, whatever it takes. What is that going to look like? And I guess a follow-up question for that too, falling into the future, you talked right before the point of Putin believing this to be like this is a personal vendetta for him to kind of get out there and win. What's going to happen when he dies? Like what kind of power vacuum is this going to cause? What issues is it going to rise? Because I don't think he has a successor at this point. And none of the oligarchs I think are going to try to find a way to win unless there's somebody that can rally the troops.
Actually, we've had, it's sort of like the legacy of Russian history is that when it collapses like the time of troubles in the 17th century, or it collapses after the revolution. That there are periods of expansion and overreach and collapse. And I've heard, some speculate, taking the long view of Russian history, that we're at the point, that inflection point, and that even if Putin wins, we're at the beginning of the end, that there will be a period of collapse and a new time of trouble. That would rival that of the 17th century. I'm not sure about that, but I think that if the team falls, we will declare it as a victory, and then they'll say that we achieved our biggest objective and portray that to the elites of the Russian people as I told you so. Now, of course, then what happens, the consequences again depends, like everyone I think is suggested on the panel, on what happens on the ground. I'm actually impressed by the robustness of the Ukrainian defense, and that they have a crap load of Stinger and Javelin missiles now. The Javelin missile has a 93% kill rate. And they have nearly 10,000 of them.
But it's supposedly gotten 15,000 into the country since the war
Since the war
started.
started,
Right.
that's more than the main battle tanks that Russia has. With a 93% kill rate, I think there might be some hesitancy to try to take the cities. But the tank in the cities is a city job.
Right.
Yeah.
And there could be an interim stage where the capital could move to Lvov.
Yeah,
You could say that as well. So we wouldn't like to see it happen, but that could be another possibility.
I think Zelensky doesn't want it.
He doesn't want to, obviously, because essentially that's what, from what Russian media is saying, it's kind of their idea, creating a very weak federation and having basically a Lviv, portion that's self-governing, and then everything else is some gradation of
Yeah, like
control.
Ukrainian lump state. So,
Exactly.
and only in the western part, across the other side of the Dnieper.
Can I ask you a question? The natural divide caused by the river, should we begin to accept that there's going to be a long-term breach break that the Ukrainians will have to accept based on that just very natural linguistic and ethnic differentiation?
I don't think they'll ever accept that. What's surprising to me is that I think Putin would have expected that the Russophone parts of the country would be less loyal to the Ukrainian state than even if that were to happen. I'm stunned, I'm actually quite stunned by the level of resistance in Kharkiv. It is an ethnically Russian city. And, there's been some research done by a colleague of mine, an expert, who's been looking at the effects of the 2014 war on both sides of the So, on the Russian occupied side, the people there feel more Russian. On the unoccupied Ukrainian government side, the war has interestingly caused those Russophones and ethnic Russians to feel more Ukrainian, because they also think of this war as a ideological war, a war between democracy and autocracy, which is just as powerful a motivator as its ethnic identity. So, frankly, no, I don't think Ukraine would ever accept that. I don't think Ukrainians on the bank of the Dnieper would accept that either.
And there's been a lot of discussion about this percentage is Russian, this percentage is Ukrainian, ethnically, linguistically. There are multiple gradations, and there's tremendous percentage of the population has relatives in one side or the other. So I mean, when the royals would try to create alliances, they would intermarry and that sort of thing. And you couldn't imagine two groups that are more interrelated. And again, there are linguistic gradations as well in terms of Russian usage within dialects of Ukrainian. So there are no clear categories here. And I think Putin's idea of classifying these two groups based on linguistic criteria is really falling apart.
Right. I mean, it's sort of based on the assumption that ethnicity trumps everything.
Right.
Which it isn't. I think that in this case, I think many are motivated by this sort of divide, that this is a war against autocracy.
Yeah.
And the truth is not so clear cut as that people want to believe. I mean, Crimea was only about 60% or so ethnic Russian. But you look at the Donbass, those regions, about 40% at most. And some of the other parts are kind of the lighter shaded parts. That's less than a fourth of the population of ethnic Russian. So even in the areas east of the river, I mean, none of those outside of Crimea were even half ethnic Russian to begin with, even before you start questioning whether ethnic Russian means you're going to support one side or the other. So I think it's a lot more split, a lot more divided than people realize. So they start expecting, well, people in Donbass are welcome as with flowers. Some of them will, some of them did, but still a whole lot that didn't, and it never would. What's up, Kharkiv?
Yeah. It is sort of interesting though that the war going on since 2014. It's not a new war. I mean, if you talk to people there, Russia invaded Donbass in 2014. So, but again, I think we tend to I think we did oversimplify the idea that, there are Ukrainians and there are Russians. The Russians are going to be on our side, Ukrainians are going to be on their side. That's a huge miscalculation, and has resulted in disaster in Kharkiv. That's been a true disaster.
The dominant Russian media line is the only city that will be with Ukraine is with it. Everyone else will accept the placement of a new leader.
The other one is Odessa, right? They thought, because Odessa has always been historically the romanticized Russian city on the Black Sea, but Odessa is resisting, Nikolaev is resisting. That's historically like a Russian city right north of Crimea. Those are the most places where the fiercest resistances occur.
Right, and if you're a tourism-based economy, you don't want to be attached to a pariah state.
No, right. Odessa's not.
The same with Crimea. That's why they haven't had much success, right? And the point here says, even if Putin wins, I don't think there is even a military victory for Putin in the chat. Even if he occupies major cities, he will face an insurgency. If he does manage to position, oops, sorry, I cut it off. So basically saying there's no way that this is ever going to go away. It's going to continue to be an Iraq situation or something like this. And so we're still talking about this in just the conquest stage. What are your thoughts on that? That with the insurgency element, and does that make this
But don't insurgencies make the invader leave ultimately?
They pose costs, that's for sure. There'll be a lot more
Cost
cost.
that you're not willing to
Right.
pay long term.
But I think I think that's true. Although I think if Putin sees these as sunk costs, then we may be in a scenario where he's continually kind of throwing good money after bad money.
And if someone funds his exploration, then he can do it as long as his sponsor allows it.
Yeah, I mean, if survival of the regime is not admitting failure in Ukraine, then it's hard to see sort of what that waffling point is. But yeah, I think the likely scenario is that it's hard to see Russia winning this conflict. It may be a short-term victory by control by removing the government or sending it in exile. But this has all the makings of a sustained insurgency.
The thing that, I would say that normally I would have believed that Putin would be reacting with incentive, but maybe his time horizon, and I don't subscribe, because I don't like to speculate about health or anything, but maybe his time horizon isn't that long. And that what's important is to, take keys, declare victory, and then somebody else's problem after it's gone.
Or someone else changes his timing because someone tells him to stop.
Well, even then, I think, it's hard to say, the demand, because they start off high, right? Effectively, they want Ukraine to surrender. That's their opening bid.
Mhm.
And we'll see if they move off of that. But there doesn't seem to be that much movement on their part, even though things are not going that well on the battlefield. As Paul said, it's essentially surrender.
It's still the same.
It's still the same, yeah.
Yeah, and one more clarification is for the people that I've interviewed in Russia and talking about Putin's attitude, they're saying this is not a recent change, right? They're saying the Western pundits or whatever saying there's been this dramatic change in the last few weeks.
It's that we were just awakened.
We're seeing the most extreme version, and basically they're saying that there's a pre-Medvedev Putin
Yeah,
and a post,
Yeah.
right? And so these are the two
Yeah.
manifestations. And so this is the important thing, is this is not a recent change. Question back in the back here.
Yeah, so you talked at the beginning about Putin's goal, or maybe to solidify his legacy as a Russian leader. Potentially, is there his underlying cause is to try to take Kiev as a historic Russian site of legitimacy, as in the Russian Tsardom or the USSR? Is that potentially what his end goal is, and he's just using this as not a proxy war, but as a justification to get there?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. It's hard to speculate on motivation. They have talked a lot about, the greatest tragedy was the collapse of the Soviet Union. You talk about the Ukrainian, especially after 2008, when we had the Bucharest Declaration that opened the door for Ukraine to join NATO. Since after that, at the Munich Security Conference, he declared that Ukraine was really not even a country, that was actually just an extension of Russia. That's where, and that also occurred with the Medvedev years too, where he became increasingly more radical about his opposition towards westward. Yeah, I think it's not just him. I think a lot of this. This is what I think. When people who were born after 1995 in Russia may not remember the bad years, the time of troubles really. 1990, the economy collapsed. People were starving. Well, they were hungry. There were no items on the shelf. And these troubling times. I mean, part of it is that I think Russians don't want to go back to that. A lot of the people who were adults back in the early 90s remember how bad it was. How Russia was humiliated. How it was poor. How it was disrespected. And for some, Putin is a hero. There was a real threat of disintegration. And then Putin enacted a lot of measures in the early 21st century to reinstitute the centrality of the state, reunifying Russia. And I gotta say, it was a long time ago when I was in Moscow in '92, and it was bad. It was really bad. I mean, there were wild dogs. They called it the kayashi, the wildlife, right? There were dogs all over the street. There was no authority. There was a breakdown of the country, and then years later you go back and, I was thinking about this because I haven't been back since 2012, right, for the Crimean thing, but boy, it was different, a lot
Very
different.
different, very different.
Yeah, amazing. It was like a modern European city
Right.
with malls, and hopefully not, underneath near the Kremlin, near Red Square. Russians have a lot to be proud of.
And they have a lot to lose.
And they have a lot to lose now.
So
But
that's
the younger
the other
ones,
thing.
the younger
The
ones
other
remember
one,
that.
right.
I think the younger ones remember that. The older ones, they see this as like, he saved the country.
Right. And even those older Russians who may not be too crazy about this might say, okay, this is his swan song. Let's win one for the Gipper. Let's let him have
Yes, that's
exactly.
right. And that's why, it's just for the restoration of Russian greatness. maybe the seizure of Kiev would be the symbol of that.
Yeah.
But
Right.
that would come at a
But
tremendous cost.
and that's a point here from the chat. So the fight for Kiev has the potential to break the Russian effort in the north, but sadly it would probably destroy the city in the process.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Ukrainians. And so this is basically what the Russian people have to face. Are they willing to pay that price? Are they willing to see the seat of Kievian Rus completely flattened in order to achieve this very obscure objective that seems to be primarily one man's?
Right.
Can I give you an example of something I've experienced in the last 14 days in talking with a friend of mine in Moscow who has been employed by an American company who has been to this country and many other Western countries in the last 20 years. And at first, before the actual invasion, her expression was, "This is a bad dream. This is awful. I feel so terrible." Kind of that sense of dread of, oh no, this can't be. And over time, as I tried to convince her to leave, tried to convince her of accepting money and various things, she was very benign. And then in the last 4 days, she has become very much focused on national pride, right? I can see it coming out in her all of a sudden, where I wasn't telling her things, but when she seemed to be unable to understand what was happening or unwilling to accept what was happening, I had to explain what was happening to the ruble, what was going to happen next, and still encouraged her to leave, to eventually try to come here. She became very defensive and started complaining about what Ukraine had done to the people in the East. This is an educated, a very American-focused person who shifted in a matter of 2 or 3 days, where she almost, if I continued the conversation, because I decided to stop it at that point, because it was not going to be productive, right? I was trying to help her, not convince her of him being right or wrong, but to help her. She began defending him and attacking Ukrainians. And so it's not at all what I expected of an educated person who was very West focused.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine, there was no surveys, but what she did was do like email surveys, academic political science departments in Russia, asked them how they felt. And her conclusion was, well, about half realized this was bad, that things were going wrong. And then she said 30% are idiots. And I thought about it, yeah, that's probably average for every country. 30% are idiots who sort of rationalize things, even though the evidence is in front of them, they sort of completely reject evidence in favor of what they believe. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised that they're not at all. They try to portray sometimes this sort of, the urban areas are different from the rural areas. Well, there might be some, but I think it's not just urban and rural. I think 30% are idiots, and that's just
Those are
The
feeling
bottom
national
line,
pride.
it's complicated. Well, we're at time, we're over time actually, so I wanted to sort of thank you all for coming out, and I'll be around here for a few more minutes, but definitely, thank you all for joining on the participant list, the Zoom list. And again, you can send any of us questions, follow-up questions, if we didn't get to your question in the discussion, but I want to thank all of our panelists for coming out here, and thank you again, thank you for coming.